Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is part 3, the final part of the career profile of Lou Duva. Now, if you've been following the first 2 parts, you will have heard stories about how Lou got into the sport, a lot of his entrepreneurship that he had in the 60s and the 70s, and of course how he actually got into the management side of boxing and training fighters as well. Some great stories across those first 2 parts, but now we head in to the final chapter of the Lou Duva career profile, and we left it at the end of the last episode where, in Lou's mind at this point, they felt like main events needed a heavyweight champion, a heavyweight in the mist that will be able to help take main events from one level to the next. So that's where we're going to begin the tale in a few moments. But before we begin the tale, I just want to say a big thank you for all those that have been listening to the season so far. We hope you've enjoyed the episodes. We've had some great comments on Spotify, and I've got to encourage you again, if you've not already commented on the episodes on Spotify, please leave a comment below. If you are on Apple, you can leave a rating, review. If you're on any other available podcasting app and it has a rating system on there, please do it. A comment system, please do it. Please drop the comment below. It really, really is appreciated when you guys do that. And also, if you are not following us on social media, you can do so. If you're on X, you can follow us at career_profiles. Or if you're on Facebook, you can follow us at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. And you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Whichever means you want to follow us by via any of them social media channels. We are also on X at BTR Boxing Pod as well, but we do have the Career Profiles podcast page individually. So, as I said, we're going to start back into the story. Now, ever since the inception of the sport of boxing as we know it today, the heavyweight champion of the world has always been the paragon. Fighters such as John L. Sullivan, Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, and Muhammad Ali were the biggest names in the sport during their reign as heavyweight champions, and they were revered globally. Lou had the opportunity to witness the great Joe Louis when he worked out for fans at his training camp at Pompton Lakes in the mid to late 1930s. Lou understood the importance of having a heavyweight star in the ranks. Such an asset would mean that main events would remain in rude health. Evander Holyfield would adopt that mantle and provided Lou with the rude health main events needed. And Lou said of his discovery of the real deal, "We knew that if main events was going to be a long-term powerhouse in the boxing business, we needed to have a heavyweight, one with the charisma of Joe Louis and the power of Rocky Marciano and the skill of Muhammad Ali and the ability to rule the division for a long time. We found our man in Evander Holyfield. The odds of Evander ever becoming a heavyweight champ were stacked against him from day one. I mean, what were the chances that a poor African-American kid, born in Alabama and raised in Georgia, would even become a boxer? Georgia isn't like New York or New Jersey, where there's a boxing gym on every corner. The top athletes in the South usually end up playing football, if not another sport. And even with him becoming a boxer, what were the odds that he would even make the Olympic team? He had to beat the top boxer in his 178-pound weight class, Ricky Womack, twice in order to make the 1984 US team. And once he got to the Olympics, who would have thought he would blow through the international competition to reach the medal round? In his first 3 Olympic bouts, he knocked out each fighter on his way to the semi-final round. Unfortunately, Evander got screwed in that fight when the referee disqualified him for a late hit in the second round. Even after his showing in the Olympics, not many people believed Evander could ever be heavyweight champion. But he did. That was the most important part of the whole puzzle for main events. Evander was an unlikely heavyweight champion contender for a company that was used to surprising people in the business. There was nothing from a physical standpoint that would point to Evander becoming a top-ranked heavyweight. He fought as a light heavyweight in the Olympics, and he had these little bird legs. He just didn't have a heavyweight build. Whilst he had the height, he didn't have the weight. No one thought he could stand up to a heavyweight shot. He was not stocky and built like a tree trunk like a Mike Tyson. What Evander had was heart, which was the size of the Empire State Building. I didn't know of Evander until the 1984 Olympics. He didn't spend years fighting on the top amateur level like a lot of the other hot prospects, but he really made a name for himself, and he gained a lot of respect from the other boxers at the Olympic Boxing Training Center in Colorado Springs during the 6 weeks leading up to the Olympic trials. Holyfield was there at the same time as Mike Tyson, who had gained a reputation as a fierce knockout artist before coming to the training facility. It's odd looking back at it, but Evander and Mike set the stage for their heavyweight showdown during those 6 weeks, even though they were 2 weight classes apart. Evander was a light heavyweight and Tyson a heavyweight. Because Tyson was knocking out his sparring partners, coach Pat Nappy asked if anyone wanted to spar with him. Evander volunteered. Evander wanted the challenge. It was a war, but it only lasted 1 round. Evander got the best of Mike, and Nappy decided to put an end to the sparring session. There was also an incident that happened in the recreation room at the training facility. Mike was bullying some of the other boxers and refusing to give up the pool table. He picked up a pool cue and was menacing some of the boxers with it when Evander walked into the room. Evander picked up a pool cue and stared down Mike. It was like a showdown at the OK Corral. Mike walked away without a confrontation. Evander always had that intense look about him. Sometimes when he stared at you, there was no way to tell whether or not he was going to shake your hand or punch you in the nose. Growing up, Evander was quite a southern kid, the youngest of 9 children, who learned how to box after his mother Annie took him to a local boys' club in Atlanta when he was 8 years old. He wanted to hit the speed bag, but the coach, Carter Morgan, told him he couldn't do so unless he joined the boxing team. So he did. You wonder what would have happened if his mother had taken him to the basketball coach or the football coach. He probably would have been a great at whatever sport he concentrated on, because he was so determined. But we were lucky. She took him to the boxing coach early on, when I, Tommy Brooks, George Benton and Ronnie Shields started working with Evander. He was very private and suspicious of people. He didn't have a lot of trust in those he didn't know well. But as we had bonded during the Olympics, and he knew we wanted him to be world champion as much as he did, he slowly started to let his guard down. Evander was a religious, church-going kid. We would even go to church with he and his mother, and I'd even sing. Everybody made jokes about my singing, though Evander had a really great voice. I remember him saying how he always wanted to sing the national anthem at one of his own fights. Evander told us that the only thing he ever wanted to be was heavyweight champion of the world. He just needed someone else to believe in that dream and push him forward. George Benton, a great Philly middleweight who later became a fantastic trainer, was the first one to suggest that it was possible to turn Holyfield into a heavyweight. This was around 1985, when Holyfield was outgrowing the cruiserweight division. George recognised that Holyfield had the ability to make the physical transformation, but he would have to grow into it, not only from a physical standpoint, but from a mental one as well. It didn't take much for George to make Danny believe Evander could be a heavyweight champion, and we started to work towards that goal before he became the undisputed cruiserweight champion. Now, if you haven't already heard our career profile on Evander, please go back and listen to it in the Career Profiles podcast feed. Now, after the Olympics, Evander made his professional debut as a light heavyweight. He didn't last long, outgrowing the weight after 4 fights. He adored fast food, particularly Burger King, which contributed to Evander's migration to heavyweight, though not in the healthiest of ways. Lou said, "We tried to get him to lose weight, but he couldn't. Eventually, we sent him to Dr. Dave Calvo in Houston. Dr. Calvo is an orthopaedic surgeon who specialises in biomedical science. If there was anyone who could tell us what was going on with Evander, it was Dr. Calvo. He measured Evander's body fat, and he told us that Evander Holyfield, in fact, had very low body fat. Based on the information from me and Dr. Calvo, Danny and George decided to move him up to the cruiserweight division, where he could fight more comfortably. It was sort of like a way station to the heavyweight division. Evander blew through his first few cruiserweight fights, fighting 4 times at that weight in 1985. He won his first match against Tyrone Booz by unanimous decision, and then knocked out Rick Myers, Jeff Meacham and Anthony Davis. Evander started 86 off by ripping another 3 wins. Knockouts of Chisenda Muti, Jesse Shelby and Terry Mims, before getting his first title shot against Dwight Braxton, who had now changed his name to Dwight Muhammad Karwi after converting to Islam. Evander had only 11 professional fights under his belt before getting that title shot. But in my mind, he was more than ready. Cowie was one tough customer. He was a brawler who was raised in Camden, New Jersey and had spent 5 years in prison for armed robbery. He learnt how to box at Rahway State Prison, the same place where James Scott served time and had fights as a light heavyweight contender. After he was released from prison in 1978, Cowie turned pro. Because of his mauling style, they called Cowie the Camden Buzzsaw. He planned on living up to that nickname against Evander. The fight was scheduled for July 12, 1986 in Atlanta, Georgia, Evander's hometown. It was unusual for the champion to go into the challenger's backyard, but Cowie didn't care. He would have fought Evander on the moon. We all saw this as Evander's coming-out party, his first World Championship fight. This was the toughest test of Evander's career. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds, though he'd never gone more than 8. Cowie was a smaller version of Joe Frazier. He had that straight-ahead style and was at home staying on his opponent's chest. It would be a close-quarters fight, and Cowie wasn't going to back down, especially to someone 9 years his junior with 18 less fights under his belt. At the press conference, I decided to try and get under Cowie's skin by doing my normal jawing. You could see Evander squirming a little as my words were making him uncomfortable. "Evander's going to beat you and take away your title," I told Cowie. The more I talked, the madder Cowie got. Before it was over, he had steam coming out of his ears. He tried to intimidate Evander and even made some derogatory comments about Evander's mother to try and get under his skin. Evander didn't say a word. He was never much for trash talking. When the press conference was over, Evander pulled me aside and said, "Why do you have to go and make him mad? That's going to make it harder for me to beat him now." "You're going to beat him." "Yeah, but that's not the point." But that was the point. I wanted to light a fire under Evander. Now, he couldn't just go into the fight with his guard down. He probably wouldn't have anyway, but now he would have to be ready for Cowie coming at him like a runaway train. We had a great time in Atlanta in the week leading up to the fight. As usual, we brought down some of my other boxers who were training at the time, Pernell Whitaker and Tyrell Biggs. It was a family affair. We worked the local media to build a lot of interest in the fight. I even boxed with the mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, in an exhibition to help promote the fight. The people of the city got behind the fight and packed the Omni Arena. They got what they paid for and more that night. It was a terrific atmosphere that afternoon in Atlanta. Evander took the ring walk with some of his Olympic teammates, Mark Breland, Pernell Whitaker and Tyrell Biggs. I think I might have calmed down Evander a little bit by doing that. None of Cowie's intimidation tricks were working. Evander, who had trouble with stamina dating back to his days as an amateur, had trained like a beast to be ready for the entire 15 rounds. He had a 6-inch reach advantage that we thought we could press during the fight. Cowie came out and tried to pressure Evander, but Evander wouldn't back down. Evander was faster and opened the fight by using his jab and throwing some vicious combinations off the jab. George had wanted Evander to be able to use his height and speed to offset Cowie's pressure. Cowie seemed content to eat a lot of punches to land his shots. It's a hard bargain that a boxer has to make with himself, particularly in a fight that is scheduled for 15 rounds. In those early rounds, George and I had to remind Evander to continue to use his reach and find his range. Evander had lapsed into fighting close quarters with Cowie, and that's exactly what the Camden Buzzsaw wanted. An inside fight worked perfectly to his thinking of breaking down Evander and then knocking him out. We kept telling Evander to keep Cowie in the middle of the ring and stay off the ropes, where Cowie could do the most damage. I was concerned about Cowie landing that chopping right hand. It was finding the mark too much for my taste. I was screaming in the corner and during the entire fight, "You have to turn him, keep turning him." Evander needed to keep Cowie moving to his right to take away that powerful right hand. In round 5, Evander was beginning to get tired. He was fighting with his back on the ropes, and it was working towards Cowie's advantage. I was screaming for him to get off the ropes and spin out of trouble. He was able to catch some of the punches on his gloves, but a few were getting through. I was worried about him taking so many shots. Finally, midway through the round, Evander brought him to the centre of the ring. Then Cowie clipped Evander with a leaping left hook to the chin near the end of the round, and Evander stumbled back to the corner. The pace was hellacious. If Evander wasn't so young and physically fit, I think he would have caved under the barrage of punches and Cowie's pressure. After the round, I was going nuts, and George, who was always the calm one, reminded Evander that he couldn't let Cowie throw first and that he needed to stick him with the jab to offset his pressure. We were so busy giving Evander instructions that we forgot to put his mouthpiece back in before we went out for the 6th round, and the referee had to send him back to the corner to get it. Evander opened the round with a blistering set of combinations. Unfortunately for him, none of them landed. Cowie just shrugged at Evander and sneered. He thought he had Evander just where he wanted him, frustrated. But he didn't know Evander's mental makeup. He was the ultimate workman. He never gave up. I'm not sure the word quit is even in his vocabulary. Because Cowie was showing no signs of slowing down, George and I thought it was time to try and crack the shell of this tough nut. We told Evander to target his left shoulder and bicep and pound it so hard that he wouldn't be able to lift his arm as the fight wore on. As Cowie advanced in the 7th round, I had one set of instructions for Evander. Hit the target. Hit the target. And I said this, screaming and screaming over the crowd noise. And he did, repeatedly. It seemed to slow down Cowie. The next concern was how Evander would react once he hit the 8th round. He had never been past that point in any fight, and now he was in an absolute war. Could he weather the storm and push past that mental barrier? Thank goodness he had gotten his second win by the 8th round, just as Cowie had begun to tire. Now when Evander fired combinations, Cowie wasn't firing back in retaliation like he'd done in the previous rounds. That allowed Evander to use the jab, something that George had been screaming at him to do the entire fight. The crowd was chanting, "Holy, holy, holy," during the 9th round, and we had taken to dumping ice water on Evander to try and keep him refreshed because of the grueling pace of the fight. Cowie was bleeding from the mouth by the 10th and continued slowing down. He was experienced, but at 33 years old, Father Time seemed to be catching up with him in the later rounds. Even still, Cowie didn't back away. He kept coming forward, pressing the action. Evander was the busier boxer, and now it was Cowie who was getting frustrated. By the end of the 11th round, Cowie looked at Evander as if to wonder what was keeping the young contender standing. By round 14, we knew that stamina was no longer a problem for Evander. He was still on his toes and moving well. Even so, I was still concerned about Cowie staying in tight. Evander shot a look at me midway through the round. I threw my left hand 4 times, stimulating a jab. Throw the jab, and keep turning him. He took everything that Cowie threw at him, and he gave it right back. It was a back and forth affair with each guy throwing heavy shots and finding their targets. Surprisingly, there were no knockdowns in the fight. In the end, Evander won a 15-round split decision to win the WBA Cruiserweight Championship. The Ring magazine bestowed upon the battle the honour of it being the best cruiserweight fight of the 1980s. It would also be crowned the 46th greatest title fight of all time in 1996. It proved that Evander had the stamina to go the distance with a rugged brawler and come out with a win. The fight did take a toll on Evander, however. He was so dehydrated afterwards that his kidneys almost failed, and he had to spend the night in hospital to receive IV fluids. The world learnt a lot about Evander Holyfield that night. The Warrior, of course, would go on to fight Riddick Bowe, George Foreman and Mike Tyson. That night, declared Lou, he proved to the world and to us in the corner that he wouldn't ever back down. Evander solidified his claim to the Cruiserweight Kingship in 1987. He defended the WBA title with a 7th-round knockout victory over Henry Tillman, a teammate and gold medal winner on the 1984 US Olympic boxing team. He fought a unification match against IBF champion Ricky Parker, stopping Parker on a 3rd-round knockout. Then he defended the titles against Ossie Aseo, knocking out Aseo in the 11th round. Evander halted Cowie in their rematch on December 5th, 1987, this time knocking him out in the 4th round. He then became the undisputed Cruiserweight champion in April of 1988 when he stopped Carlos de Leon in the 8th round, securing the WBC belt. Then came his journey to the heavyweight division. And Lou said that was really the end of the line for Evander at the cruiserweight level. There was nothing left for him to prove, and it really wasn't a glamorous division. With all 3 belts and no real challenges in the division, my son Danny, who was president of Main Event Promotions at the time, knew that there was nothing to be gained by having Evander continue to fight at the cruiserweight level, and ultimately made the decision to bring him up to heavyweight status. We had a meeting with everyone involved, and Danny laid out a plan that seemed like it would work perfectly. My part of this strategy was to find opponents who would boost Evander's morale for him to succeed in the heavyweight division. It is a division with boxers who weigh more than 200 pounds. Typically, they hit harder than in any other weight class and are able to absorb heavier shots. Even if a boxer decides that he wants to move up to the heavyweight division, there's no guarantee that he'll be able to deliver the kinds of shots or combination of shots that can knock out another heavyweight. And there are no reassurances that he will be able to take a heavyweight punch which can separate a boxer from his senses as soon as it detonates on a fighter's chin. The key was to find guys with a little less talent that would allow Evander to do what he needed to win and look good, gaining confidence at the higher weight class. Evander never turned down a fight, and everyone who fought him thought they were going to kick his ass because he was just another undersized heavyweight. That made my part of the job easy. The harder part was making Evander into a legitimate heavyweight. Evander was ready to make the move. That's what he'd always wanted anyway. He looked at Mike Tyson, whom he knew from the amateurs. Tyson weighed around 215 pounds and was knocking guys out left and right. To Evander's way of thinking, Tyson wasn't breaking guys' jaws or ribs, so he must not be superhuman. Evander figured he could punch just as hard and was better equipped at taking a few shots. Evander had been working with Tim Hallmark since moving up from light heavyweight to cruiserweight. Hallmark was a strength and conditioning coach from Houston, Texas, who had kept Evander in shape and helped him curb his fast food habit. Hallmark, who was at the meeting, felt he could build Evander to heavyweight status with no problem or additional assistance. Danny Duva had other ideas. He wanted to hire someone who could make Evander stronger and more muscular so that he could handle the bombardment he'd have to take as a heavyweight. The desired candidate was renowned bodybuilder Lee Haney. Haney had been Mr. Olympia 7 times, tying the record by Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was from Atlanta just like Evander, and while Tim didn't really think he needed Haney's help, Danny insisted. And Lou said this of the association. So, we hired Haney. Evander's first heavyweight bout was then against James Quick Tillis in Lake Tahoe, Nevada on July 16, 1988. Haney couldn't be as hands-on in terms of getting Holyfield ready for that first fight as we would have liked, seeing as he was training himself to win an 8th Mr. Olympia title which would beat Schwarzenegger's current record. So Haney sent along his assistant, Chaz Jordan, for that first meeting with Hallmark to start building a strategy before heading to training camp. There was friction from the start, as Hallmark and Jordan didn't see eye to eye. But as they were the best people for Evander at the time, we had to figure a way out for them to get along. Danny decided to do something crazy when he sent them to camp in Reno, Nevada to get Evander ready for the first heavyweight fight. His crazy idea? Put Hallmark and Jordan in the same room. He knew that by having them not only working together, but sleeping in the same room, that they'd either become friends or kill each other. We were all hoping for the former. It was impossible to ignore the friction. The two couldn't stand each other. Hallmark didn't want Jordan around and Jordan didn't want to be there. After the first week, Jordan called Haney and told him that he hated Hallmark and he couldn't work with him and said he was leaving camp and coming home. Haney told him, under no circumstances, was he to leave Reno. In as many words, Haney told Jordan that they needed to put their differences aside and concentrate on the mission at hand. Jordan calmed down and stayed in camp. We were all holding out that Danny's gamble would pay off. Before long, Hallmark and Jordan became close friends. They would eat together and ended up becoming close friends. It was one of the big factors in making this heavyweight experiment a success, and we were all relieved that Danny's gamble had paid off. The conventional thinking with boxers is that you don't want them lifting weights because it would make them muscle-bound and slow them down in the ring. We trusted Hallmark and Jordan to make sure that Holyfield wouldn't become a bodybuilder who fought like a statue. George Benson was an old-school guy like me, but he bought into all of the things that we were doing with Evander because he could see the results in the ring. Later, we hired a ballet teacher, Maria Kennett, to work with Evander on his flexibility. It really was all about building a better heavyweight, and Evander was the perfect construction project when we unveiled him for that first match against Tillis. Evander took to the programme like a duck to water. George and I would work on boxing drills in the morning, and Hallmark and Jordan had him in the afternoon. He was getting bigger, but he was also becoming more explosive in the ring. We had no doubt that he would be a powerful heavyweight with the ability to knock out the biggest guys he could, and would face. Over the course of 4 months, Evander went from 198 pounds to 217, and was chiselled muscle. Tillis was still a respected heavyweight contender when we matched him up against Holyfield. He had good ring credentials, even though there were questions about his stamina. He had a reputation of going up quickly and then fading down the stretch. It happened in matches against Pinkman Thomas and Greg Page, and the one time he went the distance, he lost by unanimous decision to Mike Weaver in a match for the WBA heavyweight title in 1981. He got tired down the stretch in that fight also. This prompted his trainer and my friend, Angelo Dundee, to say to him, "Do you want to be a bum all your life?" Though Dundee's words were strong, Tillis was no bum. He'd won a 10-round unanimous decision against the hard-punching Ernie Shavers in 1982 and was the first boxer to take Mike Tyson the distance in a fight in 1986. Even though he lost by unanimous decision, it was still a major accomplishment as Tyson was in his prime. Tillis, who got the nickname Quick because of his fast hands, would be a good first test at heavyweight for Evander. We knew he'd push him, and we had to see whether he had the physical ability to push back. That question was answered from the opening bell. Evander jumped all over Tillis and never backed off. Tillis thought he could intimidate Evander by bullying him. In the second round, he decided to try and punch Evander after the bell. Evander wasn't having any of that and he went after Tillis, and so did I. As referee Richard Steele jumped in to restrain Evander, I jumped on the ring apron and pinned both of Tillis' arms at his side so he couldn't take a free shot on Evander. Tillis' corner went nuts and his trainer, Bo Williford, jumped into the ring and raced towards me. Steele told me to let go of Tillis, and so I did. Fortunately, Evander didn't hit Tillis while I was holding him, or he would have been disqualified. Tillis was no longer the boxer who had taken Mike Tyson the distance 2 years earlier. Probably a combination of age and altitude. We were fighting at Lake Tahoe. It had him zapped, Tillis, of all his quickness. Evander was consistently beating him to the punch, tagging him at will in the 4th and 5th rounds and nearly knocked him out at the end of the 5th. At the end of the 5th round, Tillis was slumped in his corner, a beaten man. The corner called the doctor over, and the doctor advised referee Richard Steele to stop the fight, giving Evander a 5th round TKO victory in his first test at heavyweight. He made quick work of Quick Tillis, the fighter who took Tyson the distance just 2 years earlier. With Tillis out of the way, all I had to do was line up a few opponents for Evander to knock off until we could reach the goal, which was a big money heavyweight championship bout against Tyson. With their mission in mind, the team lined up Pinkman Thomas, Michael Dokes, Adilson Rodriguez, Alex Stewart and Seamus McDonough as opponents for Evander from 1989 to 1990. Evander dispatched of all of them easily and ascending to the top of the heavyweight division, becoming ranked as the #1 contender for the title by the Ring magazine in the process. The championship fight against Tyson was an inevitability. All Tyson had to do was defeat the unfancied James Buster Douglas in a fight that everyone thought would be something akin to a sparring exercise for Tyson, which would ultimately lead to a showdown between him and Evander. Unfortunately for everyone in the sport of boxing, Tyson capitulated against an unexpected onslaught from Douglas at the Tokyo Dome on February the 11th, 1990. Douglas pulled off one of the biggest upsets in not just boxing history, but sporting history when he knocked Tyson out in the 10th round. Plans then immediately changed, and now instead of getting his shot at the undisputed heavyweight champion in Tyson, Evander would be fighting Douglas for the title. This is what Lou Duva said of this madness. We had to rip up our Tyson game plan and come up with a brand new one for Douglas. While we may have been scrambling, Evander didn't change much in terms of preparation. He'd still get a very large payday and he'd still have a chance at fighting for the undisputed heavyweight championship. And to him, a fight was a fight. Douglas was a 42-1 underdog against Tyson. No one, and I mean no one, expected him to win. But Douglas did. He trained like a fiend and got himself in great shape, while Tyson most likely didn't take his opponent as seriously as he should have done. After Tyson won the title, he didn't have much of the same motivation. He admitted that he enjoyed the fruits of his victory a little too much. Plus, he was going through a long legal battle with his promoter, Don King, who sued Douglas to remain his promoter in the hopes of doing a rematch with Tyson. King had argued after the fight that Douglas hadn't won because when Tyson knocked him down in the 8th round, the ref's count was too long, and Douglas should have been counted out. Eventually, Douglas settled with King, paying him $4 million to get out of his contract to sign for the Holyfield fight. All of it left Douglas a mess from a mental standpoint. While he was able to use the death of his mother as a motivating factor in the win against Tyson, there was no way for him to deal with the distraction that followed his win over Mike Tyson. He couldn't handle all of the accolades, the attention, and the instant wealth that came with being an undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. To say it caught him by surprise is an understatement. All of Douglas's problems worked out perfectly for Evander. He was always focused. George Benton came up with a great strategy for Evander to use against Douglas. The key to the whole plan was for Evander to use a slow jab and then come underneath with an uppercut. George would always give Evander a perfect picture of how to beat the other guy, and Evander would see it and deliver it on fight night. We felt that we had Douglas figured out, but during fight week, we knew the cards were stacked against him. Douglas showed up bloated and fatter than he was when he fought Tyson. I joked that I'd been sending Douglas pizzas while he was training. He weighed 246 pounds for the fight. Evander was a trim and fit 208 pounds. Douglas came out to the ring like a zombie. He looked like he didn't want to be there that night. He was even more lost in the ring. As I was walking to the ring, I saw Dodgers manager, Tommy Lasorda, saying, "What's happening, Lou? What's going to happen?" And I replied, "Well, he's going to knock him out in 3. "What? He's going to take a dive?" No. Evander's going to knock him out in 3 rounds. Well, Evander had an easy time finding Douglas, punishing him for 3 rounds. In the 3rd round, Evander slipped a slow uppercut from Douglas and countered with a right on the chin that dropped him to the canvas. Douglas sat there, wiping his cheek as the referee counted him out. Could he have gotten up? Maybe, but it seemed like he didn't want to. My guess is that it was enough for him to take the payday and go home. Of course, we were overjoyed that Evander was now the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. It was something that he had wanted from the moment he walked into that boys' club gym in Atlanta and his first trainer told him that he could be like Muhammad Ali. The whole family climbed into the ring to celebrate. We again set our sights on Mike Tyson, who was still a big money draw to the sport, even with his loss to Douglas. Evander made his first title defence against George Foreman on April the 19th, 1991. Foreman had been on a 5-year comeback tour to regain the heavyweight title. There was a lot of anticipation for the fight because Foreman was 42 years old and had gone 24-0 with 23 knockouts during his comeback. If Foreman beat Holyfield, he would become the oldest heavyweight champion ever. It was a huge payday for both men, so the Tyson match could wait while Evander picked up a nice big check. Foreman had made a big deal of making his comeback fueled on hamburgers. He was a big man, and Danny joked that the fight should have been titled The Real Deal versus The Big Meal. It wasn't the official title of the fight, but more as a goof. When the bell rang, Foreman did not come out fighting like a fat old man. His hands were a lot faster than we thought they were going to be. In the 1st round, he was getting off first, landing that thudding looping right. He came out just as fast in round 2. Even though Foreman was landing some heavy shots, Evander was holding up well. It reminded me of when he fought Carway. We were trying to get him to stay on his toes and tire out the old man, but Evander seemed content to stand toe-to-toe and trade. In round 3, Evander started getting off first, popping Foreman with his jab. By the end of the round, he was landing some heavy combinations. Just before the bell sounded to end the round, Evander stuck a short left to Foreman's body, just under his ribcage, and then followed it up with a quick right to the nose. It gave Foreman something to think about as he went back to the corner. We told Holyfield to stay on his toes and double up on the jab to try and offset Foreman's timing. Foreman had a plodding style, but he threw heavy shots. You could hear them thudding every time they landed. Evander couldn't afford to take too many of those shots cleanly. Evander fought a smart fight against Foreman until the 7th round. That's when he decided to try and slug it out. Foreman landed some heavy shots, but Evander stood up to them and fired back. It was a back and forth round, the best of the fight, and it earned the Ring Magazine Round of the Year accolade. In the end, however, Foreman didn't land enough to sway the judges. Evander won the fight by unanimous decision and turned back Foreman, who would ultimately get the heavyweight championship by beating Michael Moorer 3 years later to become the oldest heavyweight champion at the age of 45. After the fight, Evander's popularity was at an all-time high, so making the fight against Tyson, who wanted to get back the championship, was a no-brainer. We worked out a deal for the fight and was all set to go until Tyson hurt his ribs in training and had to postpone. That would become the most expensive rib injury in the history of boxing. While Tyson was healing from his injury, he was then convicted for raping Desiree Washington a beauty pageant contestant in Indianapolis and sentenced to 6 years in prison. It was rotten timing for Evander, but there were bigger opportunities out there, and Evander was in the right spot to take advantage of them. Main Events was on a roll at this point. The Tyson situation did little to slow them down. Riddick Bowe, a silver medal winner for the US Olympic boxing team in the 1988 Games in Seoul, Korea, had entered the pro ranks and was working his way to the top of the ladder in the heavyweight division. Bowe grew up in the same Brooklyn neighbourhood as Mike Tyson. Shelley Finkel tried to work a deal with Bowe's manager Rock Newman to make the fight with Holyfield, but they couldn't come to an agreement on money, so Bowe decided to fight Pierre Coetzer to become the number one contender for Evander's title. Bowe knocked him out in the 7th round, which now put him in line for a shot at the title. Holyfield decided instead to fight Larry Holmes as a tune-up for Bowe. Holmes was 43 years old, and the fight drew similar ire as the one against Foreman, owing to the Eastern Assassin's advanced age. Lou said of the fight, "It was the same criticism we took for fighting Foreman. Everybody took shots at us for fighting another heavyweight champion who was past his prime." There was only one scary moment in the fight, an accidental elbow by Holmes, which opened up a nasty cut along the side of Evander's right eye in the 7th round. I didn't want it to get him rattled. "How bad is the cut?" he asked when he got back to the corner. "Don't worry, it's just a scratch." I lied, but I didn't want him to get scared. Not that he would have, because he's always had ice water running through his veins during a fight. He didn't ask me about the cut again during the fight. In the end, Evander did what he was supposed to do, and the fight went the distance with Evander winning a unanimous decision. It kept alive the fight with Bowe, because Evander had won the title against Douglas, who was out of shape, and then defended it against Burt Cooper, George Foreman, and then Larry Holmes. People were looking forward to the fight with Bowe, which seemed like more of a matchup for Holyfield. Bowe won the silver medal in the 1988 Olympic Games, losing the gold to Lennox Lewis. Bowe was an all-around boxer who could fight inside and out and had a great jab. He also had one of the best trainers in boxing in his corner, Eddie Futch. But Bowe didn't have a reputation for working very hard and lacked the kind of discipline outside of the ring in terms of keeping himself in shape that Evander had. George Benton knew Eddie Futch very well. Futch worked George's corner for a fight against Johnny Smith in Los Angeles in 1963. Benton knocked out Smith in the 2nd round. Later, George worked as Futch's assistant trainer for 5 years in the 1970s. George had learnt much of what he knew about training from working with Futch. George was in the corner with Eddie for Joe Frazier versus Muhammad Ali in the famous Thriller in Manila fight on October 1st, 1975. George kept telling Evander that Eddie would have Bowe better prepared for the fight than ever before. I'm not sure that sunk in with Evander. Bowe was big, tall, and incredibly strong. If Bowe listened to Eddie Futch, we knew that it would be Evander's toughest fight since he moved up to the heavyweight division. The fight turned out to be just as tough as we thought it would be. Evander had trouble landing against the 6'5", 230-pound Bowe, who was able to hit Evander with ease. We kept telling Evander that he needed to box Bowe if he was going to have a chance at winning the fight, but he ignored us. It was incredibly frustrating for the entire team. If he had followed our plan, I believe he would have won the fight. The trainers and the cornermen can't go out and execute the fight plan. It's up to the boxer to carry it out. Sometimes you're talking to guys in the corner and you're not sure they're even listening to what you're saying. They'll shake their heads and say they hear you and go out and not do a thing you just said, or do the complete opposite. Sometimes a guy has taken some shots to the head and isn't exactly thinking clearly and can't process what you're saying. Whenever I worked the corner, I was normally the screaming guy, so I knew they could hear me, but following the directions was a totally different thing. Evander normally was a good listener in the corner, and sometimes he would look over to the corner during a round if I was screaming loud enough, and he'd pick up instructions. But I don't know what was going on in the Bowe fight. I can't tell you why he didn't listen to us or follow the game plan. He seemed unusually fatigued during the fight. Maybe he just couldn't physically do what we were asking him to do. Bowe came out in round 10, looking to end things. He battered Evander with combinations, but Evander never backed down and fired back. It was a hellacious round, as both men gave everything they had. Heading into round 12, we knew that Evander was behind on the scorecard and that Bowe had gotten the best of him during the fight. We told Evander in the corner that he had to go for the knockout if he was going to win the fight. He went for it. Evander threw everything he had at Bowe, but he didn't have enough to take him down. Bowe's youth and strength might have been too much. Plus, Evander fought the wrong fight. He lost a 12-round unanimous decision, the first defeat of his career. It was a terrible loss. It made all the criticisms about him not fighting a younger heavyweight seem right on point. People had never fully believed in Evander as a true heavyweight because of the way he had come up in the division. Now it looked like they were right. Financially, we had done very well on the heavyweight run before the loss to Bo. But Evander's reputation as a heavyweight still wasn't where it should have been or where it was going to be. There were still doubts about him. Fortunately, the first fight with Bo was the beginning of what would become one of the greatest trilogies in the sport. Unfortunately, George and I would not be there in Evander's corner for the other two. After the first loss to Bo, Evander decided to part ways with us. He said he wanted to go in a different direction with his training. He told someone that he heard me say that part of the reason for the loss to Bo was because the success had gone to his head. I never said that, so I'm not sure what he actually heard. Evander opted to work with the Hall of Fame trainer Emmanuel Stewart for the rematch with Bo. He aimed to prove that he could win without Team Duva in his corner, and he did indeed win the fight on a majority decision. But despite the victory, Evander would lament his decision to veer away from Lou, and Lou said, later, Evander told me it was a mistake to fire George and me as trainers. He missed having someone like me in his corner, screaming at the referee and talking him up during a fight. My 14 years of working in Evander's corner had come to an end, but even though I was no longer in his corner or training him, main events continued to promote Evander's fights, and I never stopped supporting him. His opportunity to fight Mike Tyson rolled around just when everybody thought Evander was on his last legs as a heavyweight contender. He lost to Michael Moorer in April of '94 and looked horrible against Bobby Sue in May of '96. There was even a heart scare and him making a visit to the Mayo Clinic. Evander looked like a sitting duck to Tyson and his promoter Don King. Evander had always told anybody that would listen that he could beat Tyson. He had sparred with him as an amateur and knew that Tyson was a classic bully. If you hit him, he'd back down. Not many people outside of us thought that Holyfield could beat Tyson. That's why, when the fight was made and the odds came out, I placed a big bet on Evander to win the fight. It was the best bet I ever made. Dan was still his promoter, but I wasn't involved in the fight in any way except as a spectator, so I was free to wager as much money as I wanted on the fight. This was not the same Tyson that we thought Evander would fight in 1991. It seemed like prison had taken a toll on him, like he didn't want to fight anymore. While Evander was fighting for the love of the sport and for the chance to be the heavyweight champion again, Tyson seemed to be fighting for the money. Evander was more motivated than Tyson, and his side realised. There was just as much anticipation for the fight as there was when they were supposed to fight 5 years earlier. But now, instead of it being seen as an even match, everyone thought Tyson was going to run right through Evander. Evander had lost the world title to Michael Moorer in a fight that he entered with a torn rotator cuff. After the fight, he was also diagnosed with having a small hole in his heart. All the doctors told Evander that he would never box again. Turns out, he didn't have anything wrong with his heart, but rather that his heart problems had been caused from getting too much morphine after his fight with Moorer. In coming back, he had beaten Ray Mercer, gotten stopped by Riddick Bowe on an 8th round TKO, and looked sluggish against Bobby Sue in a 5th round TKO victory. With that said, Evander always had great concentration on fight night. You'd see it when he was walking out to the ring. If he had that little smirk on his face, the other guy was in trouble. When he walked out to the ring on November the 9th, 1996, Evander had a smirk on his face. I knew Tyson was in trouble. When the bell rang, Tyson ran across the ring immediately and he jumped on Evander, thinking he could knock him out quickly. No matter how far gone anyone thought Evander was, that wasn't going to happen. At the end of the round, Tyson slugged Evander right after the bell had sounded. I would have been in the ring getting in Tyson and the referee's face if I'd been in the corner, but Evander handled it himself. He smacked Tyson back. He'd stood up to the bully. That's when Tyson lost a mental war. From that point on, Evander had the advantage. Evander kept Tyson off balance for the remainder of the fight and was able to land combinations as he pushed Tyson backwards. He completely outboxed Tyson, and Iron Mike was never able to make any adjustments. It was only a matter of time before Evander stopped him cold. In round 10, Evander caught Tyson with a shot that sent him backwards across the ring and into the ropes. He started pounding him. The only thing that saved Tyson was the bell. But Evander picked up where he left off in the 11th, and he kept hammering Tyson until the referee Mitch Halpern had seen enough and ended the fight. It was the second time that Tyson had been on the receiving end of one of the biggest upsets in the sport. Even though I wasn't in Evander's corner, I'd been rooting for him to beat Tyson. Plus, my big bet paid off. With the winnings from that bet, we took the entire Duva family on a long trip to Italy. Thank you, Evander. I had wanted Evander to stop fighting after his loss to Bo in the third fight. He had earned about $200 million in the ring at that point, enough money to enjoy a long life. But he didn't quit, and he couldn't quit because he kept chasing the thing that had gotten into the sport for the first place, the undisputed heavyweight championship. He kept fighting, and we promoted a lot of those fights. Even though I was no longer in his corner, he was still a member of our family, and we supported him with whatever he wanted to do. They don't make heavyweights like they did when I was coming along. We probably will never see another heavyweight champion as popular as Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano or Muhammad Ali. Evander was as close as we got. The division, it had gone downhill since he was at his best. We'll probably never see another heavyweight with the heart and determination of Evander Holyfield. He loved the sport, and he wanted to be champion more than he wanted the money that came with it. It was a pleasure and an honour to work with Evander. Now, whilst Lou Duva and Main Events were busy nurturing the career of a consummate professional in Evander Holyfield, they also possessed the ultimate juxtaposition of a man in the troubled heavyweight from Poland, Andrew Golota. Lou Duva describes his association with Golota in what appears to be the epitome of madness. He said, Andrew had all the great physical tools. It didn't take us long, however, to figure out that he was no Evander. We were at training camp in Florida one day before the first Riddick Bowe fight in 1996 when he ran out of the gym crying. I can't do this, he said, sobbing uncontrollably. That's when I knew we were in real trouble with Andrew. But even before that, there were little signs here and there that should have opened our eyes. Like, my shoulder hurts, he said one time. We had a doctor that we used with him, Dr. Stephen Stoller. He travelled with Andrew because he had so many ailments. Dr. Stoller examined his shoulder 3 times and couldn't find anything wrong. We knew he was faking, so we had Dr. Stoller come into the room and leave a big needle on the table and walk out. When Dr. Stoller came back in the room, I started talking to him. Why don't you do to him what you did to the other fighter I brought to you? Dr. Stoller picked up the needle and started walking towards Andrew. I feel better, Andrew said before running out of the room. There was another time where we stopped at a drugstore and there was a girl clerk in there with a parrot. Andrew started playing with the parrot. He got some peanuts and started feeding the parrot peanuts. We got ready to leave the store. Who's going to pay for all those peanuts? The girl said. I'm not going to pay for the peanuts. The parrot ate the peanuts. I didn't eat the peanuts, Andrew said. He walked out of the store. I had to pay for the peanuts. But that's the way he was. He had a screw loose. Okay, he had a few screws loose. People always ask me if Andrew was on steroids. Whilst I never saw him taking anything strange, there was an instance where I received a troubling call from one of our trainers, Ronnie Shields. We had apartments set up in the cities where we had training camps so as to cut down on the expenses of housing our boxers. We had one place in West Palm Beach, Florida, where Andrew had been staying. Once, after Andrew had been in the apartment, I asked Ronnie to go over and clean up before Fernando Vargas came to town to stay there. Ronnie went into the apartment and found several hypodermic needles all over the apartment and bloody tissues and cotton balls. He refused to clean it up. We had to call someone else in to clean up his mess. Andrew had a rough life growing up in Kław, Poland, about 150 miles from Warsaw. An only child, his father, Andrzej, ran a TV repair service while his mother, Bożena, was a government clerical worker. His father committed suicide when Andrew was 5 years old, and his mother had a serious drug and alcohol problem and turned him over to an orphanage in Poland when he was just 6 years old. Luckily for Andrew, his aunt took him out of the orphanage and he went to live with her and his uncle. Growing up as a street thug with a reputation for having a mean streak, he was 13 years old when he broke the nose of an 18-year-old man, landing himself in trouble with the police. After a myriad of school suspensions and scrapes with the law, Andrew was sent to military training at the age of 12, where he would learn to box to channel his obvious aggression. Under the centre's rules, Andrew was ineligible to attend until he was 15 years old, though an exception was made due to Golota's already checkered criminal record. 3 years later, the exception paid off as Andrew won his first of 7 straight national championships. Many of Golot's opponents would elect to lose by default due to his considerable fighting prowess rather than face a probable hiding. By the time Andrew reached the 1988 Olympics, he was 20 years old and already an accomplished amateur boxer. He was on his way to facing Ray Mercer, a US Marine, in the finals for the gold medal when he was blighted by a cut in his semi-final bout and lost, still bagging the Olympic bronze medal for Poland. All in all, he won 111 amateur fights. In 1991, Andrew relocated then to Chicago, Illinois, and married a Polish girl. With Andrew's ambitions being simple, he was going to settle down and become a truck driver, when one day he wandered into a gym and showed the locals what he had been doing in Poland before he ended up in Chicago. Andrew then partnered up with Bill O'Donnell, a local Chicago promoter, and he turned professional in 1992. O'Donnell had Andrew fighting regionally and took him to Milwaukee for his first professional fight. Lou picks up the story about Andrew's early career. He said, he was supposed to get $100 a round, but Andrew pounded his opponent and the guy was ready to drop within the first few seconds. So Andrew literally held him up till the second round so he could collect an additional $100. O'Donnell guided him through an undefeated record in his first 18 fights before Andrew hooked up with another local businessman, Ziggy Roslaski. Andrew always thought he was a great businessman, so he and Roslaski hit it off. Roslaski also helped Andrew get out of a criminal jam he'd gotten into before leaving Poland. Apparently there was a warrant out for his arrest on armed robbery charges, and it was clear that if he ever entered the country again, he'd be arrested and jailed on the spot. From what I was told, the case came about when Andrew was in a bar with some members of the Polish national boxing team. A guy came up to them and started mouthing off, then grabbed Andrew by the arm and ripped his shirt. Andrew told the guy that he had to pay for the shirt. The guy said he didn't have any money, so Andrew pushed him into the bathroom and demanded the money. The guy told the cops that Andrew pulled a gun on him, and when the guy told Andrew he didn't have any money, Andrew stripped him down to his underwear and one sock, and then threw him into the garbage bin outside the bar. Fortunately for Andrew, he left the bar before the cops arrived. Working with two other lawyers, Rosalski got the Polish president, Alexander Kwaśniewski, to get the charges set aside so that Andrew could come back to Poland without being detained. Kwaśniewski was Poland's sports minister when Andrew was in the 1988 Olympics, and he knew Andrew well. Even though Rosalski didn't know anything about sports or boxing, he purchased Marciano's gym in Jersey City and allowed Andrew to buy into the business in 1995. Even though Rosalski didn't know how many minutes there were in a round, he knew that Andrew was ready to move to the next level. So he called me up to come and take a look at him in 1995. My first impression was that he was a real quiet type. He didn't say much, but I wasn't sure if it was because his English wasn't that great or from the stutter when he spoke. But he sure knew how to fight. I could see that from the first time I watched him spar. He had certainly earned that bronze medal in the 88 Olympics. He had a great size for a heavyweight, 6'3", 230 pounds. He had a good jab, decent power, and already had over 20 pro fights and was undefeated. In my mind, he was definitely ready to take the next step. Within a year of Andrew signing with Main Events, we had moved him into a position as a serious contender. An early warning sign of Andrew doing crazy things in the ring showed itself during his match against Samson Pucha at the Resorts in Atlantic City on May the 16th, 1995. Pucha weighed 287 pounds and probably would have been a decent fighter if he took his training seriously, did the required amount of road work to keep his stamina up, put in more rounds of sparring and working the pads and ate proper food. He was 15-1 at the time and it was supposed to be a good fight between two up-and-coming heavyweights. Andrew was having his way for the first 3 rounds, but as with Andrew, something I would soon learn, things changed quickly. In the 4th round, Pucha landed a hard right hand that staggered Andrew and kept pounding away so that Andrew had to hold on to survive. While they were in the clinch, Andrew made like a Polish Dracula and he bit Pucha on his shoulder. He reacted and tried to tell the referee Eddie Cotton that he'd been bitten, but Cotton either didn't hear him or ignored his plea. After the break, Cotton told them to fight, and Pucha's weak protest gave Andrew a few more seconds to clear his head. Andrew rallied in the 5th round and knocked down Pucha 3 times. After the 3rd knockdown, Cotton waved the fight off. Andrew had somehow escaped without getting disqualified. After the fight, a reporter came to the dressing room and was asking us about the fight and the bite. No one knew about the bite except Andrew. Of course, he claimed he didn't do it, but he was caught on camera and made headlines the following week. I was angry and embarrassed by what he did. I had never really worked with someone who had deliberately fouled another boxer like that. I asked Andrew why he did it, but he didn't answer. He just shrugged like a kid who knew he had done something wrong and wouldn't look at you and refused to answer when you confronted him. He knew he screwed up, but getting him to admit it was impossible. I still don't know why he did it. Like I said, he had a few more than a few loose screws. You never knew why he did some of the stuff he did. Andrew fought 4 more times after the Buha fight. He was now 28-0 and a serious contender for the heavyweight championship. We had done everything necessary at main events to get him ready for a title shot. Now it was up to Andrew to give us another heavyweight champion. His first bout would be against former champion in Riddick Bowe. If he could hold his own against Bowe, then we knew he was ready for the big time. Bowe had been off for 8 months since winning his third fight against Evander Holyfield on an 8th round TKO. It was the second longest streak he'd gone without fighting in his career, and it was the kind of layoff that put Bowe on the deep slide that wound up cutting his career short. He went up and down in weight so much that it eroded his boxing skills. Maybe it was because he was like the ex-heavyweight champion of the world and he'd been in with some of the top heavyweights of his time. Maybe it was because he had won the silver medal in the 1988 Olympics, where Andrew had won the bronze. Maybe he was just cocky. But Bowe didn't take Andrew seriously. He didn't care that he was undefeated coming into the fight. How do you train for a bum? Bowe told reporters before the fight. Bowe really knew how to hype a fight, but there wasn't much hype needed for this one. It was a big fight taking place in Madison Square Garden and broadcast on HBO's Championship Boxing, even though the fight wasn't for a title. Bowe answered his question about how to train for a bum by deciding not to train at all. He weighed in at 252 pounds, the heaviest of his career at this point. Lou paints the picture of what was a farcical event. We took one look at Bowe at the weigh-in and just knew that Andrew would have his way with him at the Garden that night. At the weigh-in, Andrew found out for the first time that instead of fighting 10 rounds, the match would be 12. He went back to the hotel across the street from the Garden and decided he wasn't going to fight unless he got more than the $600,000 purse that he was guaranteed. This was his way of showing that he was a good businessman. He asked for another $50,000 to go through with the fight. HBO came up with $25,000 and the fight was on. The broadcasters made a big deal out of it, saying it nearly ended the fight. But they were just being dramatic. The fight wasn't in jeopardy of not happening. Andrew was a good poker player. In the end, he would have fought for what he was contracted to fight for, but he was pressing his advantage when he had it. In some cases, Andrew was crazy like a fox. The Garden was electric. Many of the Polish fans were in the upper levels waving their red and white flags. Bowe's fans thought the former champion would just walk through this unknown guy from Poland. Through the first few rounds, the fight was playing out exactly like we expected it would. Bowe was surprised at how skilled a boxer Andrew was, and if Andrew had played it straight, he probably would have knocked him out. But he couldn't help himself. He just had to go low. When he first started dropping his punches toward the end of the third, I thought it was just an honest mistake. But after it happened a couple of more times, my mind started to go towards Andrew's history of bending the rules in the ring. Referee Wayne Kelly kept warning Andrew to stop hitting low, but it was as if Andrew couldn't hear him. We were screaming from the corner, and when he came over after the round, I got on his face and continued screaming, "Andrew, don't throw anything below the shoulder, just hit him in the head. You understand?" "Yeah, I understand." But he went right back, and he did it again and again. We didn't understand what was going on in his head. The only thing I kept thinking was, why? A few months after the fight was over, Andrew told me that Bowe had broken his jaw in the 6th round and he'd nearly passed out from the pain. He was afraid that he was going to get knocked out, and while he didn't want to lose or get knocked out, the pain was apparently too much for him. So he did the worst thing possible. He kept hitting low so he would be disqualified. It's crazy, but to him it made sense. By round 7, Kelly had already deducted 2 points from Andrew for hitting low. After deducting a 3rd point for a low blow in the 7th, Kelly told Andrew if he threw another one he would be disqualified and lose the fight. We were hoping that would be enough to keep him from going below the belt again. It wasn't. With a little under a minute left in the 7th round, Andrew landed a hard combination that staggered Bowe. He had the fight in hand and it looked to be on his way to a knockout. All those headshots, as well as the numerous low blows, had taken the steam out of Bowe. With 30 seconds to go in the round, Andrew dropped down and delivered a perfect shot way below the belt. Bo fell backward like a bowling pin, grabbing his crotch. Kelly waved off the fight and disqualified Andrew. After that, all hell broke loose. Right after Kelly waved his arms, members of Bo's corner ran into the ring, trying to get to Andrew. Of course, I was in the middle of the scrum, trying to keep them from killing him. I seem to always find myself in the middle of some kind of dust-up in the ring. I remember being in a skirmish with the John Molina and Tony Red Lopez fight at the Arco Arena in Sacramento, California. People were throwing beers at me while my cornerman, Ferdy Pacheco, was hiding underneath the table at ringside. While trying to make peace, someone from Bo's corner slugged Andrew in the head with a two-way radio. Andrew had this big guy named Inno, who was a former wrestler and bodybuilder, and his job was to protect me. He failed. I never saw Inno in the corner keeping anyone away from me. Because I had had a few heart attacks and a history of heart problems, doctors had installed a defibrillator in my chest. This was the first and only time it ever went off. Everybody thought I went down from getting hit. But the truth is, I went down from a jolt of electricity when the defibrillator went off. It knocked me back in the ring and I went down. I didn't get hit. As soon as I went down, the AMTs started pulling me out of the ring. Looking up from the canvas, all I could see was legs kicking and arms swinging. At the time, I didn't think it was going to be that bad. I'd been in enough ring scuffles to know they usually die down after a few minutes. But a full-blown riot erupted and was sparked from all those galata low blows. It was completely out of control. There were no cops in the building, and the guard and security was overrun by people from the audience who rushed the ring and started trading blows. Fights were breaking out all over the arena, and the entire thing was captured by HBO cameras, which continued to roll well after the fight was called. My family and the guys working the corner with me that night were scared that all the excitement would lead to another heart attack. They managed to put me on a stretcher and gave me oxygen as a precaution. Then they tried to take me out of the arena, up the stairs and through the riot. It was a bumpy ride to say the least. A couple of times they nearly threw me off the stretcher when it tilted over on its side. "Get me off this thing! Get me off this thing!" I kept yelling. But with all the chaos, they couldn't hear me. I was more afraid of getting dumped off the stretcher than what might happen to me in the riot. Someone even stole a ring right off my finger as I was being taken up those steps. Fortunately, I got it back later. New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani heard about the rioting at the Garden while he was at dinner and raced right over. He surveyed the damage, but the rioting was so bad that he rushed into our dressing room and kept there under guard for over an hour until things calmed down. After the dust had settled, he visited me at the hospital. He told me he was concerned about my health and wanted to make sure I was all right. I really appreciated him coming by. He might have been the only one who made it through the emergency room to see me, as my own private doctor couldn't even get past the hospital security. Andrew came to the hospital that night as well. I think he just came to get paid. They should have admitted him to have his head examined. I asked him why he kept hitting Bolo. "Because he kept bending down," he said. He said he thought the referee would stop the fight because he was beating Bo so badly and Bo wasn't throwing anything back. He kept saying the referee should have stopped it. It made no sense then, and it still doesn't today. The newspaper reporters said that Bernard Brooks Sr., part of Bo's entourage, was the one who set off the riot by jumping into the ring and going after Galata. Rock Newman, Bo's manager, was suspended for a year and fined $250,000 by the New York State Athletic Commission for his role in the melee. There were 16 people arrested and 22 injured. After that riot, Garden management decided not to have any more boxing at the arena for 3 years. Imagine that. Andrew Galata forced the mecca of boxing to shut his doors to the sport after all that history. The publicity wasn't good for them or the security. We should have known that something foul was going to happen after the fight. Bo and his team, primarily his promoter Rock Newman, had a history of creating havoc inside the ring. In a fight at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. in 1991, Elijah Tillery was pulled out of the ring by Rock after Bo and Tillery continued to fight after the bell in the first round of their fight. In the second Holyfield-Bo fight in Las Vegas in 1993, Rock and Bo's cornerman beat the hell out of Fanman when he parachuted into the ring. At the final press conference before his fight with Larry Donald, Bo smacked Donald and started a melee. Bo and his crew were always in the middle of creating chaos at the drop of a hat. Could cooler heads have stopped what happened at the Garden that night? I don't think so. Once they saw their guy getting hit low so many times, They were going to go after someone when it was all over. Andrew wasn't going to let them attack me without retaliating, and I wasn't going to back down. I've never backed down from a fight. I can't say I was always an angel during matches. I could overreact, throw punches, scream at guys, but I never started a riot, and I never hit anybody with a walkie-talkie, so I have to say that what they did was way out of bounds. Believe it or not, all the publicity and controversy for the fight fueled the call for a rematch. Bo Galata 2 was negotiated and signed for the Convention Centre in Atlantic City on December the 14th, 1996, 5 months after the first fight. We all should have had our heads examined. We did everything we could think of during training camp to keep Andrew from hitting low, even going as far as to put a pair of boxing trunks on the bottom half of the heavy bag and have him hit the top half only. But we knew that we were playing with fire by putting him back in the ring. Our hope was that he would listen and wouldn't pull the same stunt, but there were no guarantees that Andrew would ever do the right thing. The controversy of the first fight meant that the rematch was must-see TV and was placed on pay-per-view. We knew people would tune in to see if Andrew had reformed or if he hadn't learned his lesson from the first fight. Unfortunately for us, in Andrew's corner, those who bet the latter were the winners that night. Bo Galata 2 was pretty much a replay of the first fight. Galata was winning handily, knocking Bo to the mat in the second and the fifth round, but he had to resort to the low blows again. This time, he made it all the way to the ninth round before referee Eddie Cotton pulled the plug on him and he's fouling. Another disqualification in a fight that he was clearly winning, and all the judges' scorecards only proved that Galata was a head case. It made all our efforts trying to turn him into a heavyweight world champion feel like a major waste of time. After the second disqualification against Bo, boxing writer Michael Katz of the New York Daily News came up with a nickname, Foul Pole, for Andrew because of all the low blows and fouls throughout his career. It was a sad scene in the dressing room after the fight. Andrew realised that he'd blown it again. We all knew that it was the biggest mistake he'd ever make in his career. If he had won the fight, he was looking at making upwards of $20 million in future fights on HBO. But that was all down the drain because he couldn't control himself. He was winning both fights easily and tossed it away. Why? I was yelling at him. You can be champion of the world. The only guy stopping you is you. Nobody but you. Andrew started crying like a baby. I stupid. He was banging himself in the head with his hands. He was right. He was stupid. You didn't listen to me. You hit the guy low. Yeah, I know, but the referee. Don't tell me about the referee. That was it for me. I'd had my fill of him. He could have been a great fighter. He could have been a world champion. He could punch and he could take a punch. He didn't want to take it and he didn't want to punch. Later that evening, Galata was taken to the hospital for a suspected broken jaw. As he was unable to speak, I sat in with Larry Merchant for a post-fight interview. I was still beside myself from the outcome and I couldn't help but being blunt about the situation. So when Larry started his question with, "The appearance now is you may have the best heavyweight in the world," I quickly cut him off. If we held the fight in a bar, I should have walked away from Andrew then, but I couldn't. I still believed he could become heavyweight champion. He had the skills and the ability, and I thought I could get him to focus in the ring. I wanted to help him become a world champion. We started working on getting him back into the ring. We had arranged for Andrew to have a comeback fight against Ray Mercer, a tough brawler who had won gold in the 1988 Olympics. But Andrew injured his back in training, so we had to postpone the fight. After we rescheduled the fight the second time, Mercer injured his neck in training and postponed the fight again. You would think that his 2 disqualifications against Bo would have made Andrew a tough sell for a title shot. But 10 months later, 293 days to be exact, he was back in the ring. This time against Lennox Lewis, fighting in his first World Championship match in the same town, Atlantic City, where he had been disqualified for the second time against Bo. Of course, with Andrew, nothing was ever straightforward. Lewis knocked him out in the first round. Andrew took a shot of lidocaine in his knee before the fight and was woozy. Without my knowledge, or that of the New Jersey State Athletic Commission, Andrew's personal doctor had given him the shot in the dressing room. We found out about it after the fight when he passed out in the locker room and had to be rushed to the emergency room. No one in their right mind would have advised Andrew to take a shot that might make him drowsy right before a fight. It was a typical Andrew move. He'd do anything that could keep him from succeeding. 2 years later, on November 20th, 1999, at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, Golota had Michael Grant down twice in the first round, and he was hammering him throughout the fight. Grant was able to stay on his feet despite the onslaught, and in the 10th, landed a hard right that stunned Andrew, and Grant dropped him to the mat after a few more flurries. After he got up, the referee asked him if he wanted to continue, and Andrew said no. He refused to keep fighting, even though it didn't look like it, though he was seriously hurt. He just quit with 2 rounds to go, and he was way ahead on the scorecards. Not to mention it was also a WBC title elimination match, and the winner would get a chance at the heavyweight championship. I was no longer working his corner by this point. I had turned him over to Roger Bloodworth, a tremendous trainer who was part of the crew that worked with main event boxers. But with all that aside, possibly the strangest scene with Andrew came when he was fighting Mike Tyson on October the 20th, 2000. My friend Al Certo was now his trainer, and Tyson had just come off a 15-month suspension for biting part of Evander Holyfield's ear, and Golota was, well, Golota. Tyson had a tough time getting a licence from any of the states that normally held boxing shows, like New York and Nevada. Even though the suspension had been lifted, no one really wanted a part of him. His promoters got him licensed in Michigan, and the fight took place at the Palace at Auburn Hills, where the Detroit Pistons played their home games. Andrew promised to play it clean. "I'm not a dirty fighter. I take a shower 3 times a day," he joked to reporters who brought up his habit of fouling. Tyson promised to end the fight early before anything dirty could happen, and he made good on his promise. He dropped Andrew with a hard right to the chin, with 14 seconds left in the opening round. A few seconds before that, he had opened a cut over Golota's left eye. Andrew begged Al to stop the fight as he was sitting on the stool between rounds. Tyson continued his assault in the second, and Andrew held on to smother Tyson's big shots. Andrew was getting beat up, but he was still in the fight. Between the second and third round, Andrew refused to leave his corner. He refused to put his mouthpiece in and just kept walking around the ring, pushing Al away and saying, "I quit, I quit." Al kept following Andrew around the ring, trying to get him to change his mind. He kept trying to put the mouthpiece into Andrew's mouth and talk him into going out for that third round, even going as far to say to him as, "You're going to disgrace yourself." Andrew continued moving his head side to side in steadfast refusal. He didn't want to fight and conceded the fight. He quit. Mike Tyson, of course, was seething with anger and raging as he was unable to score a knockout in the centre of the ring. I wonder if I'd have been in his corner that day, whether I could have gotten Andrew to keep fighting. He said, on some level, he trusted me. Maybe I could have gotten through the confusion that was going on in his head. But knowing Andrew, who knows? Not taking the mouthpiece was a new one for me. I never had a fighter refuse to put his mouthpiece in. I did have a mouthpiece incident when I was working the corner of a fighter named Tony Alonga in a fight in Philly. The singer Lou Monty wanted to work the corner, so I let him. Between one of the rounds, I made the mistake of getting the mouthpiece out and handing it to Lou to rinse off. He never gave it back. Tony comes back to the corner after an exciting round and said, "What happened to the mouthpiece?" I turned round to Lou and asked him what happened to it, and he had it in his mouth. Al Certo was a tailor by trade, and he also had his fill of Golota after that. I could make him a suit, but I couldn't make him a fighter, he said. People can forgive a lot in boxing, biting, low blows, but not quitting. That was probably the end of Golota's legitimate boxing career, having Al Certo follow him around the ring, trying to put the mouthpiece back in, thinking he could keep getting him to fight Tyson. After Andrew finally quit boxing, he settled down in Chicago with his wife and daughter. He got into some more legal trouble, including getting arrested for impersonating a police officer. Andrew wasn't mentally or heart-wise prepared to succeed. He worked hard, but he was just missing a few screws. I had some wackos over the years. I had James Green, who started crying in the corner once he got cut. I had Tony Braxton, Dwight's brother. He was a good fighter, but he couldn't stay out of jail. When he was out, he'd do something and he'd get caught and go back in. But I never had a fighter like Andrew. It was a wild ride in the Golota corner, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. He brought some excitement to main events. You never knew what was going to happen when he stepped into the ring. In some ways, that's the beauty of boxing. Amid the fistic madness of the 90s, more tragedy would strike the Duva dynasty outside of the squared circle with Dan Duva's premature death from a brain tumour in 1996. With the fighting spirit that the Duvas had come to embody, Dan fought as gamely as Messrs Holyfield and Golota right until the end of his life at age 44, on the 30th of January 1996. And Lou recites this tragic episode of his life in his book as we deviate from the timeline, travelling backwards in the BTR time machine. He said, around the spring of 1994, Danny started to complain about really bad headaches. We all thought they would just pass, but it lingered and wouldn't pass. So Danny went to his doctor to have it checked out. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong. He didn't know what was causing the headaches. Danny went to another doctor to get checked out. The doctor couldn't find anything. It was beginning to feel like the same situation that came up with my wife Enos 10 years before. That kind of mystery illness is never a good sign. I was really worried about him. After a recommendation from another doctor, Dan went to Columbus Presbyterian Hospital in New York to get checked out. They performed some tests and did a few scans and were finally able to figure out why he was having the bad headaches. He had a malignant tumour on his brain. It was devastating news. We were all in shock. We told the public that it was benign because we wanted to keep it private. We kept the bad news in the family. Even though it was the worst news you could receive about a close family member, we couldn't let it get us down. We weren't going to climb into a hole. We were fighters. When one of us gets sick, everybody pulls together. We rallied around Danny. Dino, my youngest son, took over running the promotion side of the business while Danny battled the cancer. The doctors at the Columbia said they could operate and remove the tumour. It wasn't just the best option, it was the only option. So that's what they did. He had the surgery in October of 1994, about 5 months after he had started complaining of headaches. Even with the surgery, the doctors couldn't remove the entire tumour, so Danny had to have chemotherapy to try and shrink the rest of it. We were optimistic. We thought he would be okay, and just when we thought he might be in the clear, the tumour grew back late in 1995. This time, they told us there wasn't anything they could do, and it was just a matter of time. That was the most difficult news I ever had to hear. It had been 10 years since I'd lost my wife. Now, I was losing my oldest son. It didn't seem real. It was a double shot that nobody should ever have to deal with. Danny was not only a great businessman, but a great father as well. He had 2 young daughters, Lisa and Nicole, and a young son, Brian. There wasn't anything we could do except hope and wait. The cancer took its toll. He never got any better. Only a few months after the tumour reappeared, Danny died at Columbia Hospital. He went into hospital on Sunday and died on Tuesday, January 30th, 1996. He had a stroke on that Sunday. It was Nicole's 30th birthday. He must have known that because he didn't die that day. He held on so that Nicole wouldn't have to associate her birthday with her father's death. And that's the kind of man Danny was. He was just a smart and intelligent man. Not only would he be missed on a personal level, but he knew the ins and outs on running a successful promotion business. Looking back, we didn't know how badly he'd be missed. He was more than just a CEO. He was like our Pat Riley. Danny made the player decisions, set the roster, filled out the lineup and called the plays. Looking back, it might have been a good idea to groom someone while Danny was living to take over the business. But Danny did everything, and I'm not sure he would have wanted to groom anyone else. And because of his intelligence, personality and abilities, I'm not even sure anyone could have done all the things as well as he did them. He was a great lawyer, even though he wasn't sure if that was the career path he wanted to take. After graduating from Rutgers University, he took a year off to decide what the next step would be in his life. And during that time, he helped out with the boxing business until deciding on attending Seton Hall Law School. After graduating in 1977, he took a job with the law firm Cerreto and La Pena, located in Newark, and he worked there from 1976 to 1980 before coming over to work with us. He had set up everything for main events in 1978 and started building it from there. He had all kinds of great ideas for running the boxing promotion company. He was also one of the first promoters to get involved with pay-per-view. With his legal and boxing knowledge, many different lawyers would call him for advice on how to handle problems they had in the business. Whether it was a manager who was having trouble dealing with a promoter or the lawyer for a boxer who was having problems dealing with a manager, Danny was always willing to offer some advice. He even had his court battles with promoters Bob Arum and Don King and beat them most of the time. I think he beat Arum so many times that the guy was afraid of Danny. I once joked that when Danny was 18 months old, I put on a pair of boxing gloves on him, and after seeing him fight, I decided he'd go to law school and get to climb into a boxing ring. I never tried to force Danny into the boxing business, but I think it's like any other family business. It got in his blood from an early age. I'm really thankful that he decided to work with us because he could have gone on to some high-powered Manhattan law firm and just been as successful. He had that kind of drive and determination. Instead of thinking only for himself, he helped build Main Events into a powerhouse. Like myself, Danny didn't hold his tongue when he had an opinion about something or someone. Danny and Don King battled all the time. He once took King to task over what he thought was Don's corrupt way of rigging the judges before the Pernell Whitaker-Julio Cesar Chavez fight in San Antonio in 1993. They were in a room together 2 days before the fight, trying to settle on the judges, and at one point Don said, "What about this guy? He's good, isn't he?" And Danny snapped back, "Depends on whether you're buying or selling." That fight, which took place at the Alamodome in San Antonio, Texas, drew 60,000 people, and it turned out to be an outright robbery. 2 of the 3 judges scored the fight a draw, while 1 judge gave it to Pernell, making it a majority draw. Everybody that watched the fight thought Pernell won 9 of the 12 rounds. It drove Danny crazy. Danny would work with anyone to make a fight that would benefit our boxers. But he didn't let anyone try to get away with shady stuff without calling them out or taking them to court if necessary. After Danny's death, my son Dino took charge of the promotion side of Main Events. I was confident that Dino, an accountant by trade, would be able to pick up where Danny left off. They had both been involved in the business since they were kids, and Dino worked side by side with his older brother while he was building and running Main Events. We had learned just around that time that Danny went in for his first brain operation, that he had prepared a new will. It left Main Events to his kids in trust with his wife to control until they were of legal age. They were now the sole beneficiaries of Main Events, and my kids were all just employees that could be fired at any time. Because we were all dealing with Danny's illness, no one really gave it a second thought. We still thought they all had a stake in the company. Main Events were still running. They were putting on shows. The boxers were happy. Everything was running well until right after Danny's death. Kathy was attending Seton Hall Law School just like Danny had, and she was busy with school and raising the kids. At some point, around 97, 98, when Kathy finished law school, she was ready to come back to work full-time. There was a lot of stress and some personal issues being dealt with as Dan's passing was still fresh in everybody's mind. No one was having fun anymore. Everyone had been through a lot, and it was taking its toll. The whole situation became very tense for us, and some personal conflicts developed. Things started to get legal, and it almost went into a full-blown trial for control and structure of the company. Once the lawyers got involved, I worried that there was no hope of working anything out as a family. This was not the kind of fight I was used to. There would be no winners, no matter how it ended. It ripped me apart. I felt like everything I had been working for all those years was unravelling before my eyes. The business was never about money. It was about doing something that brought the family together and having fun doing it. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. Everyone decided to settle after just one day of discussions, as we all were ready to move on with our lives. While it really upset me that the family was no longer involved in the company together, I'm just glad that it did not go to trial. Everyone has since moved on. It was not the same, and it still wasn't, but things could have been much worse. You look around when everything is happening and say, how do you handle it? You want to do the right thing and have everybody satisfied. In the lawsuit, no one was happy. I gave up everything, the bail bonds business, the union, to start that company. I gave up everything and worked hard for all those years to build that company up, and in the end, I was left with nothing. What hurt the most was not having the family together anymore. When the family was all together, it was like a holiday every day. The number one item for me was to take care of my family. Whatever the makeup of the family was, I wanted to take care of them so that everything would come out okay. Now I'm the bastard. There is little contact between me and the grandkids now, and that hurts more than anything. I used to have a very close relationship with Brian, Dan's son, when he was a kid, but all that ended when Kathy severed the business relationship. As crazy as it sounds, I still want it to come out right. It hurts because I know this isn't the way that Danny wanted it to work out when he set up his will. But I've been a fighter all my life, watching everything I had worked for hard, almost 50 years, get snatched away, and it was tough. Watching my son Danny die was even tougher. It was the kind of knockdown that most people wouldn't get up from. But get up Lou did, and in style. Despite the legal wranglings and lingering heartache, he started Duva Boxing in January of 2000 with the same plan in mind, running a family business that would put on good, entertaining shows where everybody could enjoy themselves. Lou's role mirrored the one he adopted at main events, finding boxers, making matches to put on the shows and training some of the boxers and being the face of the organisation. He had the experience and the contacts to discover boxers and negotiate a path to them becoming world champions. At 79 years old, Lou still loved the sport and he revelled in its pressures, except the repeated ones involving his beloved family. 3 months after Duva Boxing was formed, the team received yet more bad news. After losing his wife Eunice to MS, Danny dying of brain cancer and losing main events, Donna found out that she had multiple sclerosis. Her eye had swelled up during a trip to Baltimore, and after visiting the doctor, it was discovered that she had a brain infection. Of course, it brought back terrible memories for Lou, because it was the same disease that Lou's wife Eunice had succumbed to. Despite the constant setbacks, Lou persevered. He said, "It was time to roll up my sleeves and start building a new company." Being busy working with a new promotion company took away some of the pain, but it would never fully go away. And with that, we hit the ground running. My son-in-law, Tommy Brooks, along with Courage, Chashabala and Diego Rosario, 2 of my former fighters, were the trainers for Duva Boxing. They were guys who could get the message across to the boxers as to what we wanted and expected from them. They were all good teachers. That was very important because we were going to have to build the company with young fighters, and because we didn't have a huge budget, we couldn't afford to go out and offer big signing bonuses to top boxers who were coming out of the 2000 Olympic Games. I didn't even go to Sydney, Australia for the Olympics to look at the top amateur boxers. It was like we were building an NFL team through the college football draft, except we would have to do it with middle and late round picks. During my time at main events, we had some guys who were fantastic boxers, but didn't have the greatest character. This time, I wanted to make sure we took high-quality character guys to build our foundation. That meant we could concentrate on training them to become the best boxers they could be, and we'd have a load of world champions without having to worry about the out-of-ring issues. It would take a slower process, but there would be less hiccups along the way. That was the theory. The only member of the 2000 US Olympic team that we signed was Dante Craig. We also signed such up-and-comers as James Kirkland, Oscar Diaz, Sean George, Kendall Holt, Alex Mejas, Curtis Meeks and Demetrius Hopkins. While they each had terrific amateur careers, they weren't in the same group as the 2000 Olympians like Ricardo Williams and Jermaine Taylor. The next step was to sign some veterans so we could have shows that were attractive for television. We were able to get a lot of our fights on ESPN because of this, and so we signed Omar Sheikha, Bronco McCart, Thomas Tate and George Khalid Jones. Later on we added light heavyweight Kelvin Davis and heavyweights Samuel Peter and Kirk Johnson. One of the first veteran guys I brought over to Donna was Omar Sheikha, a Palestinian kid from Patterson who was a very good amateur. He fought at super middleweight. He had some good wins as a professional on his record before he started fighting for Duva Boxing, including a win over Glenn Johnson, the man who knocked out Roy Jones Jr. to become the light heavyweight champion. He also had beaten Simon Brown, who was a tough Jamaican-born boxer who won the IBF World Welterweight title in a 14th round TKO against Tyrone Trice in 1988 and added the WBC and lineal welterweight titles by beating Maurice Blocker by a 10th round TKO in 1991. He had 9 title defences before losing the WBC belt to Buddy McGirt. Brown gained much notoriety for his fight against Vincent Petway in 1995. Petway knocked Brown out in the 6th round as Brown continued to punch straight up in the air while unconscious and lying flat on his back. Omar was a brawler and a boxer. He had a very entertaining style, one that was perfect for TV audiences. Omar connected us with Thomas Tate, who was a veteran super middleweight from Detroit. Thomas was trained by his brother Frank, who had won a gold medal on the 1984 Olympic team. I got to know Frank from our work together on that Olympic team. Frank was part of the Cronk Gym coming up as an amateur, but signed with the Houston Boxing Association and Josephine Abercrombie after the Olympics. He had a very good professional career, and he beat Michael Olajide for the vacant IBF World Middleweight title in 1987. It turned out to be a good connection because we were able to get them into a position to fight for the IBF Super Middleweight title. We put Sheikha and Tate together in a fight in Philadelphia on ESPN. The winner was going to take the vacant USBA Super Middleweight title and be ranked number 1 to fight for the IBF title. Both guys were in great shape for the fight, but there was only one problem. They both wanted me to be in the corner on fight night. Tate was disappointed when I told him that I'd be in Omar's corner for the fight. Even though Tate was 35 years old, he still had a lot in the tank. We thought for sure that Omar would be able to handle Tate and that we'd get that title shot and he'd be Duva Boxing's first world champion. It was a tough decision, but I went with Omar because he was from my hometown of Paterson, and that old neighbourhood pride still had a tremendous pull on me. Well, we went into the fight with much confidence. Things took a sideways turn in the first round when Omar took a shot to the right eye, which immediately began to swell. We had Joe Souza, one of the best cutmen ever to work a corner, trying to bring down that swelling in between rounds. But as the fight went on, the swelling just kept getting worse and worse. Thankfully, it didn't stop Omar from going after Tate. In fact, it might have made him fight harder. Omar started battering Tate in the second round, knocking him through the ropes once, but referee Eddie Cotton called it a push. Then later in the round, Omar was beating Tate so bad that Tate's corner told him to take a knee to stop the barrage for a few seconds. It didn't help him much. Omar dropped him again in the third. Even though Omar was pounding Tate, his eye was getting worse. It looked like he had a purple tennis ball under his eye. He kept saying he could see, and it certainly wasn't affecting his ability to attack Tate. After the fourth round, the ringside doctor took another look at Omar's eye and stopped the fight, giving Tate the victory by TKO. Of course, I went crazy in the ring like I always did in these situations. My fighter was getting screwed, and I wasn't going to stand by and let it happen without saying something and going after whoever was close by. It was a bullshit call by the doctor. Omar could see and was winning the fight. There was a lot at stake for this fight to end this way. Unfortunately, no amount of screaming and arguing was going to change the decision of the doctor. Omar lost, and Tate won. This meant another title opportunity for Tate, who had lost in his 3 previous opportunities at a world championship. To get the title, Tate would again have to face Sven Ottke. To make matters worse for Tate, he would have to travel to Germany to get the championship. Ottke was unbeatable in Germany, receiving a lot of questionable decisions there to keep his record spotless. It didn't take away from the fact that he was a very good boxer with an outstanding amateur career. He had 308 amateur fights, even though he started at the young age of 14. He fought on the 1988, 1992 and 1996 German Olympic teams. The first time Tate and Ottke fought in 1999, the fight ended on a technical decision in the 11th round when the referee stopped the fight because of a cut Ottke had on his left eye. They said the cut was caused by an accidental headbutt, but Tate swore it was from a punch. The referee wasn't buying it, so they went to the scorecards. Ottke was leading on all 3 scorecards and got the victory. The cut didn't look that bad, but they were fighting in Germany, Ottke's backyard. Tate knew that if he was going to get a victory in the rematch, he'd probably have to knock out Ottke, which seemed like a tall order for a 35-year-old boxer fighting on foreign soil. It didn't happen. Tate wasn't up to the task that night as Ottke dropped him in the second round and cruised to a pretty easy victory. 4 times Tate had fought for the World Championship and had come up empty each time. That was it for him. Tate retired from boxing after the fight. Duva Boxing would have to wait another 4 years before they got their first world champion, Kelvin Davis, who beat Ezra Sellers for the IBF World Cruiserweight title. The main thing Lou remembered about Davis was that he had the lightning bolt tattoo on his face and he had a twin brother who didn't look anything like him. He had the Tyson face tattoo before Tyson had the face tattoo. Lou said, "I guess he thought he made him more intimidating." Kelvin would come to press conferences wearing a ski hat, goggles like glasses and a big headphones. I'm not sure he ever heard anything that was going on. You'd have to get him to take the headphones off if a reporter wanted to talk to him. After our first year in business in 2001, we had to deal with tragedy in the ring. It wasn't one of our boxers who got hurt, but was still a devastating situation that no one will ever forget and something that you never want to go through in the sport. Like a lot of the boxers we signed, George Kelly Jones was a New Jersey guy. He was born in Paterson and he had a tough upbringing. His father left his mother when he was really young, and later his father got him involved in narcotics. He said his mother took out an insurance policy on him when he was 9 years old so she could afford to pay for his funeral. When he was 19, he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and spent 3.5 years in a youth correctional facility. In 1990, George was out of prison for less than a year before he was busted for heroin possession and sent back to prison for another 3 years. That's when he took up boxing. He liked the sport, but it wasn't enough to keep him on the straight path. He went pro after being released from prison and built an 11-0 record, but was still dealing drugs. He was arrested and convicted again for selling drugs in 1997 and spent another 3 years in prison and at a halfway house. But this time, he found religion and completely transformed his life, taking the name Khalid as part of his conversion. In Arabic, the name Khalid means eternal. When we signed George, he was 32 years old and a changed man with a wife and kids. With his age, we knew that we had to try and move him into contention for a championship as quickly as possible. George was a hard-punching southpaw with a record of 15-0 with 11 knockouts when we set up a match against light heavyweight contender David Telesco. It was a big step-up fight for George as he had never fought anyone of Telesco's calibre. Telesco had gone the distance against Roy Jones Jr. at Radio City Music Hall 5 months before he was supposed to fight George. George had been away at training camp, working as a sparring partner in Cologne, Germany. It had gotten him in very good shape, but during training, Telesco had to pull out of the fight at the last minute with a broken nose. George felt that he pulled out because he knew it would be a tough fight. Once Telesco pulled out, we were scrambling to find an opponent who was willing to take the fight on short notice. We found Beathaven, Scotland, a 26-year-old southpaw from Maryland who had fought most of his career as a super middleweight. He was a good boxer. He'd actually fought Thomas Tate the year before, losing a 10-round decision, as well as 2 decisions to Eric Hardin in 1997. Going in, we thought it was an even fight. We had decided to put the fight on the Intrepid, the retired aircraft carrier that had been turned into a museum docked on the Hudson River in New York City. When it was active, the aircraft carrier was called Fighter One. It had survived kamikaze attacks during World War II and was also used during the Vietnam War. The scene for the fight was fantastic. It was a beautiful summer evening, and the setting on the Hudson River was perfect for the fight, which was being broadcast on ESPN. Behind the scenes, it was far from beautiful. You had to run up and down 3 flights of stairs to get to the flight deck where they had set up the ring. The locker rooms were in the bowels of the ship. The steps were on a narrow spiral staircase. It was still a great idea and wasn't a problem until after the fight. Going in there was no way of seeing how tragic this night would be. I wasn't working George's corner that night, but rather sitting ringside with my friend, comedian Pat Cooper. George had a 3-inch height advantage, and he immediately started using it to his advantage. He didn't have any problems using his jab effectively. George was landing almost everything he threw, but Scotland was fighting back. While Scotland wasn't backing down, a bad cut opened over his eye in the 3rd round. By the 5th round, Scotland wasn't returning punches as often as he was in the previous rounds. George staggered Scotland with a hard shot to the temple, but he didn't go down. In Scotland's corner, his trainer, Adrian Davis, was threatening to stop the fight after the 5th round and before the start of the 6th round if he didn't pick it up. Scotland talked him out of it. By this time, Pat and I were standing up and screaming, "Stop the fight! Stop the fight!" It was obvious that Scotland had no chance of winning and was taking a real beating. The fight went on for 3 more rounds. Scotland refused to go down, and George kept up the pressure. Referee Arthur McCanty Jr. didn't step in because he thought Scotland was throwing enough punches to protect himself. With 48 seconds left in the fight, George landed a left and 2 rights, and Scotland staggered forward and fell to the canvas and didn't move. That was it. George wanted to celebrate, and he started to, but then saw that Scotland wasn't moving on the canvas. As the doctors and corner crowded around Scotland, you knew the situation wasn't good. Soon EMTs were in the ring and putting Scotland on a stretcher. It was a sad, sickening feeling to witness. George was so upset. He was shaking on his way back to the locker room. Because of the location of the fight, they had trouble getting the stretcher inside the elevator to get Scotland to the ambulance waiting outside. By the time they got Scotland to the hospital, he was already in a coma. They performed an operation to stop the bleeding on his brain, but he never awoke from the coma. He died 5 days after the fight on July 1st, 2001. George was torn up about it. He wanted to reach out to Scotland's family, but he wasn't sure how to approach them. He didn't know how they would feel about him. I convinced George that it was important for him to go to Scotland's funeral. He understood the importance of it, but was scared of the reaction to his presence. He had been having nightmares and couldn't sleep. Instead of driving down to Maryland, we decided to take the train, which gave me an opportunity to talk to him and try and calm him down. This isn't about boxing anymore. This is about being a man and about the test that you face in life. This is the time where you show what kind of a man you are. If you're ever going to move on, you have to conquer this first. We made it to the funeral, which was held at the Metropolitan Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. George was still scared. He didn't know what it was going to be like facing Scotland's family. Scotland was in a casket that had a belt laid over it. The belt said, "Our World Champion." There was a pair of blue boxing gloves hanging over the side. Scotland's family could have made things very uncomfortable for George, but they didn't. Some of his uncles came over to George and told him how much they appreciated him coming to the funeral and paying his respects. They admired his courage. When he got back home from the funeral, George was still torn up about what had happened. It shook him to the core. He even told his family that he was giving up boxing. And he did. He went back to his full-time job at a Patterson printing company. Going to the gym was no longer part of his life. Then something strange happened. George got a call from Scotland's wife. She told George that she didn't blame him for what had happened to her husband. She said that Beethoven would have wanted him to keep boxing. She even came to one of George's fights in Baltimore to root him on. George was surprised by the call, but it relieved him and took away some of the emotional pain of having to deal with an opponent dying following a fight. He got back in the gym and we set up a fight against Eric Harding for December, 6 months after the Scotland fight. No one was certain how George would react in the ring. He said he had gotten over the fear of hitting his opponent too hard when he was sparring in training camp in Germany. I had planned on being in his corner for the fight. But me and my hot temper again, I got into an argument with Lorenzo Di Clemente, Harding's manager, before the fight. The stress from the argument set off the defibrillator in my chest and I had to be rushed to the hospital. George climbed into the ring at the Monaghan Sun in Connecticut on December the 14th, 2001, wearing a pair of trunks with B R.I.P. sewn on the side. It was a good tribute, but George carried more than that into the ring with him that night. It was probably too soon for him to get back. It was obvious that he was holding back against Harding. He never attacked him, and Harding knocked him out in the 7th round. There were 11 more fights after that, but I'm not sure George ever fully got over what happened that night on the Intrepid. I'm not sure anyone involved in that fight did. George never got another opportunity to fight for a world title. He lost to Glenn Johnson in an IBF elimination match in the final bout of his career in 2005 and retired shortly after. A year after the start of Duva Boxing, the company began to grow. Dino joined in as well. He wanted to get us into the heavyweight world championship mix, so we got Michael King to invest in helping him sign heavyweight contender Kirk Johnson and Samuel Peter. King was an entertainment industry power broker. He and his brother owned the production company that syndicated shows like Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, The Oprah Winfrey Show, and Dr. Phil, to name but a few. King was also heavily involved in boxing. He had the idea of signing a bunch of ex-college football players and converting them into heavyweight boxers to revive the division. King passed away from pneumonia in 2015 before he could see his dream come true. Charles Martin, one of King's boxers, won the IBF heavyweight title in 2016, defeating Vlasishev Glaskov on a 3rd-round TKO 8 months after King died. It was a lot of work to get both Peter and Johnson into the heavyweight championship picture. Johnson was a heavyweight from Canada, Nova Scotia to be exact, but he wasn't Lennox Lewis, an Olympic gold medalist from Canada. He wasn't as athletic or as tough as Lewis was. He also wasn't as dedicated to the sport and lost in both of his title shots against John Ruiz and Vitaly Klitschko. Peter was from Nigeria and he was nicknamed the Nigerian Nightmare. He was much tougher than Johnson and probably more polished. A hard puncher, Peter struck fear into his opponent. He was a serious contender. Eventually, he won the heavyweight championship by beating an overmatch and fading Oleg Maskayev. But Peter couldn't overcome the Klitschkos, losing to both Vitaly and Vladimir in championship fights. Their top-rated heavyweights helped to put Duva Boxing on the big stage, though it came at a significant financial cost. As company funds were dwindling, a 50% stake of Duva Boxing was sold to Don King. Donna Duva protested such a move, feeling that it represented a leasing of the future of the company to people who really had no interest in seeing it succeed, despite their on-paper interest. It appeared to be like a good move at the time, as the money helped finance a heavyweight championship fight for Samuel Peter against Oleg Maskayev. He beat Maskayev for the WBC title, losing it 6 months later to Vitaly Klitschko. He never held the championship again. Now, despite the sacrifices made, Duva Boxing would eventually capitulate. Lou explains the end of days, and he said, "In the end, the deals we thought would help the company didn't work out the way we had hoped. Eventually, they cost us everything. We got Kirk Johnson a fight against John Ruiz for the WBA title in Las Vegas on July 27, 2002. Things started badly when a security guard tried to toss Dino's son Louis out of the arena for not having a ticket for the seat he was in. Donna was furious and got into it with the security guard and took Louis back to Johnson's dressing room. As the night started ugly, it continued that way in the ring. Johnson was disqualified in the 10th round for throwing low blows. A funny thing happened to me on the way to the arena. I actually got a call from Andrew Galotta wishing me luck. And the feeling was felt by many. As Larry Merchant of HBO said at the end of the bout, a fitting conclusion to a horrible fight. In 2008, we had the heart ripped out of Duva Boxing. Oscar Diaz was one of our brightest young stars. He was one of the first amateur boxers we signed when we formed the company in 2000. We thought he'd be Duva Boxing's greatest homegrown champion. Oscar was a clean-cut kid from San Antonio, Texas, with a great family. It was not hard to love him. One of the keys to the company was not having to worry about our fighters outside of the ring, and Oscar fit right into that category. He even stayed in our house when he came to New Jersey to train and felt like a member of the family. Other fighters could always count on Oscar supporting them. He'd come to all the fights with us, and being with him was like being with one of my children. He was a fight guy and a fighter's friend. He was always a happy-go-lucky guy. He always talked about how important it was for him to win a championship. It was in his blood. He was in a lot of good, exciting fights, always giving it his all. He'd get pissed off when he didn't win because he thought he had let everyone down. The first one he would blame for a loss was himself. Oscar had done a great job moving up the ladder from prospect to contender, but took a slip backwards when he lost a decision to Ebo Elder in 2004. It wasn't a major setback, but enough to knock him off stride towards fighting for a world title. After that loss, Oscar put together 7 straight wins before getting a shot at Chris Smith. On June 14, 2006, in a fight that nobody thought he'd win, Oscar beat Chris Smith in Dover, Delaware for the WBA and NABA and the vacant NABF welterweight title. Nobody thought he'd won except for us and the judges, who gave him a unanimous decision. He was now one step closer to a title shot. So, we put him in against Golden Johnson, who had been a tough lightweight contender but was now something of a welterweight gatekeeper. We thought Oscar would win the fight, especially in front of his hometown in San Antonio at the Alamodome. Instead, Johnson ended up stopping Oscar on an 11th round TKO. Another setback, but again nothing major. After a couple more fights, we decided to bring Oscar back into his hometown at the San Antonio Municipal Auditorium against Delvin Rodriguez for the vacant USBA welterweight title. It was the kind of crossroads fight that made for an interesting matchup. Rodriguez had also been knocked out in front of his hometown crowd by Jesse Feliciano at Foxwoods Casino in Connecticut just 2 fights before the matchup. Neither boxer could really afford to lose the fight if they expected to remain in contention for the welterweight title. We thought Oscar would have extra motivation against Rodriguez, given that he was fighting at home. It was a give-and-take fight through the first 7 rounds. Rodriguez had a height and reach advantage and used it to box at a distance, but Oscar was relentless and kept coming forward. In the 4th round, Oscar caught Rodriguez with an overhand right that staggered and nearly sent him to the canvas. As the fight went on, Oscar's face started to show signs of all the clean shots that Rodriguez had been landing. But as he had always done in his fights, he was giving it as good as he got. By the 9th round, Oscar's right eye was nearly swollen shut. Rodriguez kept jabbing away at the eye, but Oscar wasn't backing down. He kept coming forward. He wasn't taking a beating. I'd seen him take worse shots than Rodriguez was hitting him with. He didn't look like he was about to get stopped by Rodriguez, though he took a pretty good shot near the end of the 9th round. After the 10th round, Oscar got up off his stool before it was time for the next round to begin. The referee came by the corner and asked Oscar how he was doing. Oscar groaned, his legs buckled, and the referee supported him as he continued to slump. The referee immediately waved the fight off, and we all jumped into the ring to try and get him to sit on the stool. The paramedics jumped right into the ring to attend to Oscar. He was sitting on the stool and holding the side of his head when he nearly fell over. The doctors stretched him out on the canvas and gave him some oxygen while putting him on a stretcher and rushing him to the hospital. I was devastated. We went right to the hospital where the doctors didn't know if he was going to live or die. They found out that he had a blood clot on his brain and that they had to cut his skull open to release the pressure. He was placed in a medically induced coma. It was touch and go for a couple of days. Oscar was in a coma for 2 months. But then we got a call from the doctors who gave us a date as to when they were going to bring him out. I flew out and made sure to be by his side when he awoke. When he opened his eyes for the first time, he smiled, and that was one of the happiest moments of my life. The doctor said that with therapy, he'd make a full recovery. So we immediately started looking for places for Oscar to get the kind of therapy that he needed to get better. I made arrangements for him at the University of Houston Rehab Center. Oscar was ready to go there, but his mother wouldn't let him go. The thing was, it wouldn't have cost her a cent. I couldn't talk her into putting him into the rehab center in Houston because she wanted him to be close to her in San Antonio. She said she didn't want Oscar to be away from her, and so she put him in a nursing home in San Antonio. We visited Oscar often. It wasn't a good environment for him to get better. I would hold his hand and talk to him about getting some treatment in a better place, and he'd just cry. After a while, his mother moved him out of that nursing home, and she wouldn't tell us where she moved him. We even hired a private investigator to try and find out, but she kept moving him around. We couldn't find out where he was. It was a very sad situation. We never saw Oscar again after they moved him from that first nursing home. That was enough for Donna. She didn't want anything else to do with boxing after that. It completely turned her off from the people in boxing. They tried to blame Tommy and me for Oscar getting hurt. They tried to say that he wasn't in shape or that he was dehydrated. None of that was true. They said we should have stopped the fight because he was taking a beating. But at the time, no one even thought about stopping the fight, including Oscar. 7 years after he'd collapsed in the ring, on February the 26th, 2015, Oscar died in a San Antonio nursing home. He was just 32 years of age. I cried when I heard the news, and I was devastated as we were the night of the fight. He brought it all back as if it had happened the day before. Donna had gotten out of the business, but I didn't. I couldn't. It was my life. I loved it too much. So I kept working with the boxers we had. Even with our new business plan, headaches were still cropping up, as they always seem to do with boxers. We had Michael Torres, who was a good fighter, but was a little crazy. He was on par with Kendall, but maybe just a little more talented. He was always moving around with his girlfriend and baby. We didn't give him a signing bonus, but we were paying him $2,000 a month. For a year, we did that, but he wasn't fighting anybody. He became such a pain in the arse that we sold his contract to Top Rank. Cameron Duncan bought his management contract at the same time as we sold his promotional contract. In 2010, we officially closed shop on Duva Boxing. The Oscar Diaz injury had zapped Donna of all her enthusiasm, and the financial moves made to get us to the top had backfired. I still like working with the boxers, but the business side of things had changed those relationships with the new crop of boxers coming in. Instead of bringing the family together, the business was driving us further apart. My run was over. I'd accomplished more in boxing than I ever thought I would, and seen more places in the world than I could have ever imagined. I was inducted into the New Jersey Boxing Hall of Fame, the International Boxing Hall of Fame, the Italian American Sports Hall of Fame, and had been voted Manager and Trainer of the Year a few times by the Boxing Writers Association of America. Most of the honours that you can receive in boxing, I received them. Boxing has been my life for the last 70 years, and nothing will ever turn me off from the sport. I still love it to this day. Even though I'm not actively involved in training boxers anymore, and we no longer have Duva Boxing, I still get calls from people asking me about certain fighters. I keep up with boxing by watching the fights on TV. The sport took me all around the world. France, England, Moscow, Germany, Mexico, you name it. I also had the opportunity to meet all kinds of people, including politicians, athletes and entertainers, saints and sinners. It's hard to say if those experiences would have been available if not for boxing. It fed my family, gave us a place to live, brought us together and even tore us apart. Getting to know and work with some of the greatest names in boxing, like Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, George Benton, Angelo Dundee, Pernell Whitaker and Evander Holyfield, has been an unbelievable experience and a wonderful education that makes me very grateful. With everything I accomplished, of course, there are always things that you'd like to go back and change if you had the opportunity. I have to say that, with all the ups and downs, I don't have any regrets. While I suffered painful losses with the death of my dear wife Eunice and my beloved son Danny, I still had plenty of fun with the shows at the Patterson Armoury and Ice World. In the end, I was smart enough to know right from wrong in different situations. When any fighter was doing the wrong thing, I got on his arse. I always tried to have fun and included my family, while at the same time making my boxers feel that we were all related. Looking back, it seems like it all happened in a blur, but I can say with a smile that it's been a wonderful ride, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. The legend that is Lou Duva, of course, would eventually pass away of natural causes at the ripe old age of 94 on Wednesday, the 8th of March, 2017. He trained and managed an impressive portfolio of professional champions. Notable mentions of those he's trained are, of course, Evander Holyfield, Pernell Whitaker, Michael Moorer, Vinny Paz, Meldrick Taylor, Andrew Galotta, Matt Breland, Tyrell Biggs, and even Britain's own Alex Arthur. On the management side of things, Lou worked with more esteemed names such as Joey Giardello, Zab Judah, Rocky Lockridge, and Johnny Bumpus. What a life, and what a career profile. And we're going to leave Lou with the final words. And this is what he said. I love what I'm doing. It's my life. When it's time to go, I'll probably be fighting to get out of the casket. I'll be yelling at the priest instead of a referee. And that brings an end to the career profile of Lou Duva. It's been an amazing ride. We hope you've enjoyed the episode, and we hope you've enjoyed the career profile as a whole on Lou Duva. 3 parts, different parts of his life, different moments of his life that I've really, really, really enjoyed learning about. Learning about how he became an entrepreneur, how becoming an entrepreneur helped him fund his desire to become a boxing promoter, a boxing manager, a boxing trainer. Everything that he did within the sport is absolutely legendary. Now, we've covered trainers on here before, and some of these trainers are only that. They're just trainers. But Lou did it all, didn't he, really? He was a professional himself. It never worked out for him, but he moved on and he trained professionals, he managed professionals, and he was just an absolute figure in the sport. And growing up myself personally, I remember Lou Duva. I remember him always getting in the ring and shouting and screaming at people, and going through his career profile has brought back some of those great memories for me personally, and I'm sure those of a certain age will probably also remember Lou Duva as well. But if you are younger than, say, 40, you probably haven't fully experienced Lou Duva and what he was like, so it's probably worth you going back and looking at a few of his fights, looking at a few of his interviews, and his book in particular that I mentioned in part 2 was a massive source for it. Of course, we've got loads of quotations that we used out of there and other sources for this episode, and we hope we've been able to really depict what Lou Duva's life was all about. If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you do let us know. You can let us know on Spotify by commenting below if you're listening. If you've watched it /listened on YouTube, there's a comment box below to leave a comment on what you think about not just this part of the story, but the whole story overall. If you've enjoyed it and you're listening on Apple, make sure you leave a rating on the Career Profiles podcast. Leave a rating, leave a review. It really, really, really does help. If you haven't heard any of our other episodes that we've done which features Lou Duva, please do go back and listen to them. We've done the tale of Evander Holyfield and Riddick Bowe. We've done Moorer versus Forum. We've done some great, great shows on the Career Profiles podcast or on the Legendary Nights feed as well. So there's a good opportunity for you to go back and listen to some of those episodes if you haven't done already. A big shout out to Jamie Albrecht, of course, the co-host for the main BTR Boxing Podcast show. He puts the scripts together, he puts the stories together. It's been a great story on Lou Duva. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So big thanks to you, Jamie. It's been a great educational episode and series of episodes for me to do personally as well. A big shout out also goes to the patrons of the podcast for subscribing to us through patreon.com. As a result of that, they've had this episode earlier than everybody else, and they've also got it ad-free. Now, if you're not a patron and you can support us, please go and check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast, because on there we are able to provide you with all the additional things that we don't provide you on the normal podcast feeds. A big shout out goes out to the newest member of Patreon, which is David Gatti. David Gatti from Canada, thank you so much for subscribing to us through Patreon. And a big shout out goes out to the rest of you guys that have been long-time subscribers. Thank you so much, as always, for subscribing to us on Patreon. But that is it for this particular episode. If you've got any more thoughts and feelings on the show, on the episode, please, again, I implore you to let us know. But that is it. We hope you've enjoyed the life and the career of the legendary Lou Duva.